Here we are at Camp Fremont, where real men and real soldiers are made. You folks at home should see the camp for yourselves to really appreciate the beautiful health and nature spot it is.
Harry C. Freeman.
The story of Camp Fremont begins on April 6, 1917, when the United States declares war on Germany, entering into the First World War. Military surveyors searching for sites for military camps came to the peninsula in May of the same year, and were struck by the area's resemblance to the rolling foothills and open fields the troops were expected to encounter in the battlefields of France. At the time, Menlo Park was little more than a farming town of 2,300 people, with a downtown only a few blocks long and a number of residents still struggling to accept the concept of electricity. After a deal to establish a base in Palo Alto fell through due to space restrictions and the prevalence of saloons near the proposed campsite, the Johnson Dairy Farm in Menlo Park was chosen to be the 20th Division encampment of the National Guard. The first 300 troops, which had arrived in what is now Palo Alto High School on July 7th, were relocated to the 1,000-acre farm, and construction began with the help of nearly every carpenter on the peninsula. The camp was to be modeled after the camps found on the battlefront in Europe. To facilitate the construction effort, El Camino was paved for the first time, and 4,800 feet of additional railroad track was laid by Southern Pacific. Altogether, the camp and all associated land, including artillery firing ranges and marching practice areas, occupied over 23,000 acres.
The good citizens are nonplussed, haven't even decided whether to be pleased or dismayed, look dreamily perturbed, and generally feel like 6,000 folks 6 minutes from a downpour with only 6 umbrellas between them. The San Jose Mercury Herald.
On August 22nd, construction of Camp Fremont came to a halt. Realizing that the camp sewage system could contaminate the local water supply, the State Board of Health had threatened to prevent the military from constructing the camp unless it agreed to install an improved sewage system at an estimated cost of $500,000. Having already spent $750,000 of its budgeted $1.25 million to construct the camp, the military couldn't afford the sewage system. Before a compromise was reached, the 40,000 National Guardsmen originally slated to be trained at Camp Fremont were instead sent elsewhere. Because of this, when construction resumed, the camp was instead slated to house and train regular Army troops instead of National Guard troops. By mid-October, the camp housed 3,500 personnel, but the completion of the camp was again cast in jeopardy when finances began to run low. In order to compensate locals for use of their property and pay for the new sewage system, the camp required an additional $150,000. The money was slow in coming. In December, a group of Los Angeles businessmen took advantage of this predicament and offered the military $2 million to move the camp to Los Angeles. This drove citizens on the peninsula to dig deep into their pockets to preserve their local pride. By the end of the month, donations from the likes of DeYoung, Hearst, and local companies and governments had raised enough to keep the camp in Menlo Park. In early January 1918, the 4,000 men of the 15th Infantry Brigade began the long march from the San Francisco Presidio to Camp Fremont. Along the way, they were entertained by YMCA volunteers, reading poetry and singing. When they arrived at Camp Fremont on January 5th, they combined with the 16th Brigade already stationed in the camp, forming the 8th Division, nicknamed the Pathfinder Division. Training of the over 7,000 members of the new division began the next day.
To regular Army troopers, Camp Fremont's climate was a soldier's dream. Colonel William S. Strobridge.
The life of a soldier at Camp Fremont was about as good as possible for a regular Army trainee. Many of the soldiers were from far afield and had never witnessed a climate so temperate and pleasant. At Camp Fremont, soldiers were trained as if they might see conflict the next day. The camp had been selected because of the similarity of the area to the battlefields of France, and the camp was built and run in the style of military camps on the Western Front, complete with French and British officers to acquaint soldiers with the European way. Soldiers could often be found learning to operate and fight with Springfield bolt-action rifles equipped with bayonets. Soldiers were also prepared for the new threat of chemical warfare with training in the use of gas masks, which most soldiers found ill-fitting and uncomfortable.
We carried that crazy mask around for about 3 weeks. They tell us the purpose of the mask is to prevent the possibility of our being suffocated from poison air. Why they should so seriously object to our suffering death from poison air, and then turn around and cover our breathing apparatus with instruments that made it impossible for us to secure any air at all, is a mystery. Colonel Alfred Allo, the 12th Infantry.
Perhaps a vestige of colonial warfare, troops spent much of their training practicing marching, and marches were often accompanied by their regimental song. In fact, music was perhaps the camp's greatest strength. The camp held an immensely successful interregimental musical competition in Stanford Stadium in 1918. Cavalry units were also trained at Camp Fremont, and horses were used as transportation for higher-ranking officers. In addition to regular cavalry and infantry training, the camp trained medical corps officers. Whenever they weren't training, soldiers engaged in a variety of activities. Sports and athletics were highly emphasized at the camp. Participating in boxing was mandatory, but soldiers greatly enjoyed many other sports. A total of 50 acres of the camp was set aside for athletic fields, which included 2 football fields, 2 baseball diamonds, volleyball courts, and a track. The camp sponsored many sporting events to encourage camaraderie and provide entertainment for the soldiers. The Knights of Columbus building, built near the close of the camp in 1918, acted as the officers' lounge and served as the camp's religious center until a church was constructed at a later date. The so-called Garden Theater was also central to the camp and hosted frequent vaudeville performances. Monty the Bear and Jock the Monkey were kept on the premises to promote morale. These were the mascots of the 319th Engineers, one of the most prominent and largest of the regiments in the camp. A 35,000-volume library, as well as a skating pavilion, also entertained the soldiers in their free time. Of course, food was also a big part of camp life. The mess hall was a popular place at all times of day. Soldiers occupied tents fashioned in the style of those found on the Western Front, each accommodating 6 soldiers. On his day off, the life of a soldier extended far beyond the borders of the camp. Soldiers visited the towns of Palo Alto and Menlo Park. The activity of soldiers in downtown Menlo Park led to the opening of the Fremont Theater on the corner of Oak Grove and El Camino. Soldiers also commonly took the train up to San Francisco from Palo Alto. The camp was considered to have excellent relations with the surrounding towns. The soldiers provided business for local establishments, and local YMCA volunteers were heavily involved with the camp. Events such as the band competition at Stanford Stadium, the Remount Station Rodeo, and the influenza epidemic that struck in September 1918 brought the locals and soldiers closely together as they entertained and supported one another. For those who stayed at the camp, a common pastime was to write postcards home to their families or to write poetry, much of which was published in the camp newspaper, Trenchant Camp. Many of these poems spoke of a burning desire to go into battle. In spring of 1918, General William Sidney Graves received orders to station troops in Siberia to protect supplies that had been landed at Vladivostok on Russia's eastern coast from German forces. The mission was highly sensitive. Secretary of War Newton Baker, upon giving Graves his mission, said to him,
"Watch your step. You will be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite."
Graves mobilized the forces stationed in Camp Fremont to fulfill his mission. On September 2nd, the first soldiers from the camp arrived at Vladivostok by boat. However, the officers and troops at Camp Fremont were never educated on their mission. Most didn't have any clue who the Bolsheviks were, and were pleasantly surprised when Vladivostok proved not to be a perpetually snowed-in cowtown. Within 2 months after the first soldiers arrived, all 5,000 troops that had been stationed at Camp Fremont had landed in Vladivostok. The American soldiers represented one of the 15 countries that had dispatched troops to Siberia. While many of these offered support to the anti-communist White Russians, The American troops remained neutral in accordance with strict orders from President Wilson, intended to protect their highly sensitive mission. However, in protecting the Trans-Siberian Railroad from the supposed German threat, the soldiers from Camp Fremont ended up fighting against the Bolsheviks, as well as groups of Siberian and Chinese terrorists. When armistice was declared on November 11th, the troops in Siberia were not sent home. With no clear indication of the true purpose of their mission, and with an increase in the ferocity of both the Siberian winter and the Bolshevik Revolution, the Americans from Camp Fremont began to question why they were still stuck in Siberia months after the Great War had ended. Had they been forgotten? Eventually, congressional representatives began to lobby on the behalf of what became called the Forgotten Army, attempting to find the reason for keeping the troops in Siberia. However, to this day, it has never been stated why the Americans remained in Siberia. It was not until April 1st of 1920 that the soldiers from Camp Fremont finally deported from home, after combat, disease, and most of all, the Siberian winter, had claimed 300 American lives. By the time the soldiers arrived back in the States, however, Camp Fremont had been dismantled, and little was left but remains to this day. Today, there is little in Menlo Park to suggest that the area once bustled with military training. As the Palo Alto Times noted in 1919,
"It's expected that the camp will be no more than a memory within the month."
Indeed, most of the camp was sold to scrap or transferred to Fort Mason or the Presidio by the end of January, with a final sing-along commemorating the closure of the camp on May 4th of the next year. However, traces of Camp Fremont still linger today. The MacArthur Park restaurant on University Avenue was designed and constructed in late 1917 by famed architect Julia Morgan. During the camp years, the building served as the YWCA Hostess House, where soldiers, relatives, and friends met and attended events, including weddings. The house also included a mending bureau, where soldiers could bring clothes for repair. Additionally, what is now the Oasis Beer Garden on El Camino Real was the YMCA building in Camp Fremont, acting as a recreation and reading center for the troops. The camp's most significant contribution to Menlo Park, however, has been its base hospital, now the Menlo Park Division of the Veterans Affairs healthcare system. Originally constructed at a cost of $500,000, the base hospital treated more than 1,800 troops during the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918, and housed hundreds of patients, including paralytics, tubercular patients, and those suffering from combat wounds acquired overseas. With the closure of the camp, questions arose as to the future of the hospital, but those were quickly quelled when the Federal Department of Public Health bought the property in October of 1919. Though training exercises may not take place here any longer, and the thunder of artillery has not been heard in these hills for decades, the legacy of Camp Fremont and the forgotten army it trained will live on in the memories and histories of the people of the Menlo Park community. As an editorial in the Palo Alto Times said,
"With the final relinquishment by the government of all claims on Camp Fremont and the official closing of the camp, one more ghost of romance has gone to become a community tradition along with the redwood tree, Palo Alto, the Stanford Residence, and Frenchman's Tower."